The morning sun cast long shadows across Portland's brick-lined streets as James Wilson adjusted his navy blue veteran's cap. It was just past 7, and the city was slowly coming to life with the usual buzz of early risers heading to work. The smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the air, making his stomach rumble, a reminder that he hadn't eaten breakfast yet. James had moved to Portland 3 weeks ago, hoping to start fresh after finishing his military service. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him a lot about life, but adjusting to civilian life in a new city brought its own challenges. Every morning, he would walk through different neighborhoods, trying to piece together a routine that felt right. Today's wandering had led him to a cozy-looking place called Morning Brew Cafe. The cafe's windows were decorated with hand-painted coffee cups and pastries, and a small chalkboard sign outside promised the best coffee in downtown. Through the glass, James could see vintage posters on exposed brick walls and comfortable-looking wooden chairs. It looked exactly like the kind of place where he could become a regular. A bell chimed softly as he pushed open the door. The warm aroma of freshly ground coffee beans wrapped around him like an old friend's embrace. The cafe was already half full with morning customers, a couple of construction workers enjoying their breakfast sandwiches, some office folks in business attire typing away on laptops, and a few elderly regulars chatting quietly in the corner. James joined the short line at the counter, pulling out his phone to check his emails. He'd been applying for security consultant positions, hoping his military background would be an asset. As he waited, he overheard snippets of conversation, someone talking about their kid's science project, another person discussing weekend plans. It felt normal, peaceful even. The menu board above the counter listed an impressive array of coffee options. James smiled to himself, remembering how he used to dream about good coffee during his deployments. Back then, they'd joke about opening a coffee shop that served nothing but simple, strong black coffee, none of these fancy vanilla caramel whatever lats. But now, standing here, he was actually looking forward to trying something different. An elderly woman in front of him fumbled with her wallet, spilling some coins. Without hesitation, James knelt down to help her gather them up. "Thank you, dear," she said with a warm smile that reminded him of his grandmother. These small moments of everyday kindness were what he missed most during his time overseas. The cafe seemed to have everything he was looking for in a morning spot: good location, friendly atmosphere, and the kind of diverse crowd that made cities feel like home. Some places just have that feeling, that instant comfort that tells you found somewhere special. As the line moved forward, James was already thinking about making this part of his daily routine. Looking around, he noticed the little details that made the place unique: local artists' work on the walls, a small bookshelf with well-worn paperbacks, and a community board filled with flyers for local events. It was exactly the sort of place where people could build connections, where a newcomer like him could slowly become part of the community. What James didn't know was that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but ordinary. As he reached the front of the line, preparing to order his coffee, he had no idea that the next few minutes would not only change his life, but would spark a chain of events that would impact the entire community. Sometimes the biggest moments come disguised as the smallest decisions, like choosing where to get your morning coffee. Just as James reached the front of the line, ready to place his order, the atmosphere in the Morning Brew Cafe shifted. The gentle hum of conversation died down as Michael Brenner, the cafe owner, burst through the swinging kitchen door. He was a tall man with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a white apron that had seen better days. Brenner's eyes locked onto James, and his face twisted into an expression that made several customers look away uncomfortably. The owner walked with deliberate steps toward the counter, ignoring his young barista, who was about to take James's order. The girl behind the counter, probably no more than 20, took a small step back, her welcoming smile fading. "We're not serving today," Brenner announced loudly, his voice cutting through the cafe's peaceful atmosphere like a harsh alarm. A few customers looked up from their laptops, coffee cups pausing midway to their lips. The elderly woman James had helped earlier turned in her seat, her face showing concern. James, maintaining his composure, spoke quietly. "I'm just here for a coffee, sir." His voice was steady, reflecting years of handling tense situations during his military service. He'd learned long ago that staying calm was often the best response to hostility. But Brenner wasn't interested in calm. "I said we're not serving," he repeated, his voice getting louder. Then, with a sneer, he added, "Certain people aren't welcome here." "I think you know what I mean." The cafe had gone completely silent now. Someone's spoon clinked against a coffee cup, the sound sharp in the tense quiet. A businessman in the corner slowly lowered his newspaper, his eyes widening at the scene unfolding before him. The young barista looked desperately between her boss and James, clearly distressed but unsure what to do. James took a deep breath, his military training kicking in. He'd faced much worse situations in Afghanistan, but somehow this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his own country, his own neighborhood. "Sir," he said, his voice remaining level, "I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else here." Brenner leaned forward over the counter, his face reddening. "I don't care what you are. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." He jabbed his finger toward the door. "Now get out before I call the police." The irony of the threat wasn't lost on James. He'd spent years protecting people's rights, including Brenner's, only to face this kind of treatment at home. Around the cafe, phones had quietly emerged from pockets and purses, their cameras capturing the scene. A woman in a business suit near the window had pulled out her phone and appeared to be recording while trying to remain inconspicuous. "Actually," James said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his veteran's ID. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, Marine Corps." He placed the ID on the counter, not as a plea for special treatment, but as a mirror to reflect the absurdity of the situation. "I'd fought for everyone's rights, including yours, Mr. Brenner." The owner's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, and then, surprisingly, even more anger. "I don't care if you're a veteran, the Pope, or the President himself," he spat. "This is my cafe, and I make the rules." By now, other customers had begun to stand up. The elderly woman James had helped earlier was shaking her head in disgust. A group of construction workers at a corner table had stopped eating their breakfast sandwiches, their faces dark with disapproval. The young barista had tears in her eyes, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter. James looked around the cafe, taking in the scene. He could see the mix of emotions on people's faces: shock, anger, shame, and sympathy. Some avoided eye contact, while others stared directly at Brenner with undisguised contempt. In the corner, a woman in professional attire was typing rapidly on her phone, her face set in grim determination. "All right," James said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cafe. "I'll leave, but you should know, Mr. Brenner, that this isn't over." He turned toward the door, his movements deliberate and dignified. As he reached for the handle, he heard chairs scraping against the floor. Several customers were getting up to leave as well, their untouched coffees left on their tables in silent protest. In the corner of Morning Brew Cafe, Lisa Chen had been quietly working on her laptop, preparing notes for her next news story. As a reporter for the local news station, she'd covered many stories, but she never expected one to unfold right in front of her. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard as she watched the scene between James and Brenner develop, her journalistic instincts kicking in. She wasn't the only one paying attention. Throughout the cafe, phones had emerged from pockets and bags, recording the incident discreetly. A construction worker's coffee grew cold as he held his phone steady, capturing every word of the exchange. His hands were trembling, not from the weight of the phone, but from the anger he was holding back. City Council member David Thompson sat frozen by the window, his morning bagel forgotten. He'd chosen this cafe for its quiet atmosphere to review some city planning documents. Now, he found himself witnessing exactly the kind of discrimination he'd been fighting against in City Hall. His mind was already racing, thinking about ordinances and civil rights violations, but more importantly, about the human being who was being treated so unjustly. A young college student in the back, wearing headphones, had pulled them off when the commotion started. She was live streaming the whole thing on her social media, her followers' comments flooding in with shock and outrage. Her hands shook as she tried to keep the camera steady, knowing that what she was capturing needed to be seen. Near the counter, a retired schoolteacher clutched her purse tightly, her face showing the pain of recognition. She'd taught for 40 years and had seen the lasting impact of discrimination on her students. Now, watching history repeat itself in this small cafe, she felt her heart breaking all over again. Thompson noticed two businessmen in suits who had been having a breakfast meeting. They exchanged glances, pulled out their phones, and began taking photos of the cafe's sign and license displayed on the wall. One of them was quietly typing an email, his face set in grim determination. Later, it would turn out he was contacting his friend at the Civil Rights Commission. Lisa Chen had already texted her news director. This wasn't just a story about one incident in one cafe. It was about the bigger picture, about how far we've come and how far we still have to go. She noticed how the young barista behind the counter was fighting back tears, probably torn between her job and her conscience. That would be an important detail for the story. The elderly woman who James had helped earlier had pulled out her flip phone. Though she struggled with the camera function, she was determined to document what was happening. Her hands might have been shaking, but her resolve was steady. "My grandchildren need to see this," she whispered to the person next to her. "They need to know it's not just in history books." A group of regular customers who came every morning sat stunned at their usual table. They'd always thought they knew Brenner, had laughed at his jokes, enjoyed his coffee. Now they were seeing a different side of someone they thought they knew, and it made them question every friendly interaction they'd had with him. Through the window, pedestrians had begun to slow down and stop, watching the scene inside. Some pulled out their phones to record through the glass, creating an impromptu audience on the sidewalk. A delivery driver who had just parked his truck came to stand among them, his delivery forgotten as he witnessed the unfolding situation. What none of these witnesses knew was that their documentation would soon become part of something bigger. Each phone recording, each social media post, each witness statement would come together to tell a story that couldn't be denied or explained away. Their silent witness would give voice to countless others who had faced similar discrimination but had no one there to document it. The weight of all these eyes on him seemed lost on Brenner, who was too caught up in his own prejudice to notice that his actions weren't just being seen. They were being preserved, shared, and would soon be judged by far more people than just those present in his cafe that morning. The witnesses might have been silent in the moment, but their evidence would soon speak volumes. As James stood near the cafe's entrance, memories of his military training flashed through his mind. He remembered his commanding officer's words during a particularly tense situation in Afghanistan. "Your strongest weapon isn't your gun, it's your composure." Those words had never felt more relevant than now, standing in a coffee shop in his own country, facing a different kind of battle. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the medals pinned to his jacket, medals he wore not for show, but as a reminder of the brotherhood he'd found in the service. In his unit, they never cared about the color of your skin. They cared about whether you had their back when things got rough. Taking a deep breath, James turned back to face Brenner. The cafe had fallen completely silent, every eye focused on what would happen next. James's voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, carrying the weight of experience that went far beyond his years. "You know, Mr. Brenner," he began, "when I was serving overseas, I protected everyone's rights. Not just some people's rights, everyone's. I've seen men of every background give their lives for the freedoms we enjoy here." He gestured around the cafe, "including the freedom to run a business like this one." A couple of customers nodded in agreement. The young barista behind the counter had stopped pretending to clean and was listening intently, her eyes wide. Even the morning traffic outside seemed to have quieted down, as if the city itself was holding its breath. "During my 3 tours," James continued, his hand unconsciously touching the service pin on his lapel, "I learned that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when you're scared. And standing up to discrimination, that's always right." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. His old unit gathered around a Humvee in Afghanistan. "These men and women," he said, holding up the photo, "they became my family. White, black, Asian, Hispanic, none of that mattered when we were out there. We protected each other. We protected our country. We protected your right to serve whoever you want in your cafe." Brenner's face had turned an even deeper shade of red, but James wasn't finished. His voice remained calm, but now carried an edge of steel that made several customers straighten in their seats. "But you should know something, sir. The America we fought for, it's better than this. The country we risked our lives for doesn't have room for this kind of hatred. And while you have the right to your opinions, you don't have the right to discriminate. That's not just my view, that's the law." The construction workers in the corner had put down their phones and were now standing, arms crossed, nodding in solidarity. The elderly woman who had dropped her coins earlier wiped a tear from her eye. Through the window, more people had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion but staying to witness something remarkable. "I'm going to walk out of here now," James said, his dignity intact. "Not because you have the right to kick me out, but because I choose not to give my business to someone who judges people by their skin color rather than their character. But make no mistake, this isn't over." As he turned to leave, he caught sight of his reflection in the cafe window. He saw not just himself, but the face of every service member who'd fought for equality, every citizen who'd stood up for what's right, every person who'd faced discrimination with dignity rather than hatred. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open, but before he could step out, something unexpected happened. A voice called out, "Wait!" It was one of the construction workers. "If you're leaving, we're leaving too." The sound of chairs scraping across the floor filled the cafe as customer after customer stood up, leaving their half-finished coffees and untouched pastries on the tables. James paused in the doorway, his hand on the handle. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly through the now-silent cafe. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with words and actions. And sometimes the most important victories aren't won on battlefields, but in small cafes and quiet moments like this one. By sunset that same day, the video of James's encounter at Morning Brew Cafe had spread across social media like wildfire. The young college student's live stream had already reached over 50,000 views, and other recordings from different angles were being shared rapidly across various platforms. The incident had struck a nerve in the community, turning a quiet local cafe into the center of a citywide conversation about discrimination. Lisa Chen's news report aired on the evening news, her voice steady as she stood outside the now-closed cafe. "What happened here this morning wasn't just about one man being denied service," she reported. "It's about a community deciding what kind of city they want to live in." Behind her, a group of veterans had gathered, many wearing their service caps and holding signs reading "Veterans Against Discrimination" and "All Heroes Welcome." The construction workers who had witnessed the incident had spread the word through their union. By mid-afternoon, dozens of their colleagues had joined the growing crowd outside the cafe, many of them sharing their own stories of discrimination they'd faced or witnessed. One older worker, his hard hat still dusty from the job site, spoke to the news cameras. "We build this city together. Every building, every street, every cafe, it's built by all of us for all of us." The elderly woman who had dropped her coins that morning had called her church group. They arrived with folding chairs and thermoses of coffee, setting up an impromptu gathering on the sidewalk. "We're having our coffee right here," she announced to anyone who would listen. "In the fresh air, where everyone's welcome." Local business owners from neighboring shops began to step forward. The bookstore across the street put up a large "All are welcome here" sign in their window. The diner 2 doors down offered free coffee to anyone who had walked out of Morning Brew in protest. Small acts of kindness and solidarity began to multiply throughout the neighborhood. Online, people were sharing their own experiences with Brenner's Cafe. A food delivery driver revealed how he'd been told to use the back door. A former employee spoke about the discriminatory hiring practices she'd witnessed. Each story added another piece to a puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. The city council member who had witnessed everything, David Thompson, called an emergency community meeting for that evening. The local community center's main room was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air was thick with emotion as person after person stepped up to the microphone to speak. "My grandfather fought in World War II," one woman said, her voice trembling. "He came home with medals on his chest to a country that still wouldn't serve him in restaurants. Today, I watched history repeat itself, and I say, never again." A group of local veterans had organized a peaceful protest scheduled for the next morning. They coordinated through social media and text messages, planning to form a line outside the cafe. The wheels of justice began turning faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, City Council member David Thompson was already in his office, the circles under his eyes showing he barely slept. Spread across his desk were printouts of civil rights laws, public accommodation regulations, and dozens of emails from concerned citizens. "I've seen enough," Thompson said to his assistant, looking up from a thick folder of previous complaints about Morning Brew Cafe. "Get me the city attorney's office." His hands shook slightly as he dialed the number, not from uncertainty, but from determination. As someone who had witnessed the incident firsthand, he knew this wasn't just another case to file away. The city attorney's office was already buzzing with activity. The young law clerk who first received Thompson's call quickly realized this was bigger than a simple complaint. Within hours, a team of legal professionals had gathered in the conference room, their coffee growing cold as they reviewed the evidence. "We have multiple video recordings from different angles," one attorney pointed out, spreading printed screenshots across the table. "And look at this, social media posts going back months showing a pattern of behavior." The wall behind them was covered with post-it notes, each one representing a different witness or piece of evidence. Meanwhile, at the police station, more people were coming forward. A former employee of the cafe stepped into the detective's office, nervously clutching her old work apron. 6 months after that fateful morning at Morning Brew Cafe, the street looked different. The old cafe's warn sign had been taken down, and workers were busy installing a new one that read Unity Coffee House. The transformation wasn't just in the name, it went much deeper than that. After facing multiple lawsuits, heavy fines, and the loss of his business license, Brenner had been forced to sell the cafe. The story could have ended there, with another empty storefront in the downtown area. But that's when something remarkable happened. James, the veteran who had faced discrimination that morning, was having coffee with some fellow veterans at a diner down the street when an idea struck him. "What if we turned that place into something positive?" he suggested. The idea spread through their network like wildfire. Within weeks, a diverse group of investors had come together, veterans, local business owners, and community members who believed in second chances. They pooled their resources, and with help from a local business development fund, they'd purchased the old cafe space. "We're not just opening another coffee shop," James explained to a reporter as construction crews worked behind him. "We're creating a place that stands for everything that cafe wasn't: inclusion, respect, and community." The walls had been repainted in warm, welcoming colors, and local artists had been invited to create murals celebrating the city's diversity. The young barista who had witnessed the original incident was one of the first people James hired for the new cafe. "I couldn't sleep that night after what happened," she shared while learning to use the new espresso machine. "But now, being part of this, it feels like healing." The construction workers who had stood up that day were hired to handle the renovation. They worked with pride, knowing they were part of something bigger than just another building project. "Every nail we drive, every wall we paint. It's about building the kind of place we want in our community," their foreman said, wiping sweat from his brow. The elderly woman who had dropped her coins that morning became the cafe's first regular customer. She brought her knitting group with her, and soon the corner table became known as the Wisdom Corner, where young people would often stop by to chat and learn from their stories. The cafe's mission statement, framed near the entrance, read, "At Unity Coffee House, we believe every person deserves respect, every story deserves to be heard, and every cup of coffee should come with a side of humanity." Below it hung photos of local veterans from all backgrounds who had served their country. On opening day, the line stretched around the block. People came not just for the coffee, but to be part of something meaningful. James stood behind the counter, wearing an apron with the cafe's new logo, a coffee cup with hands of different colors wrapped around it. The city council member who had witnessed the original incident was there to cut the ribbon. "This is how change happens," he said to the crowd. "Not just through laws and regulations, but through people coming together to turn something negative into something positive." The cafe quickly became more than just a business. They started a program offering job training to veterans transitioning to civilian life. Local schools brought students for field trips to learn about discrimination and the power of community action. Every month, they hosted community dialogues where people could share their experiences and learn from each other. The young college student who had live-streamed the original incident now runs the cafe's social media, sharing daily stories of community and connection. "Every post is a reminder that love is stronger than hate," she explained, snapping a photo of veterans and students sharing breakfast and stories. 1 year after the incident, James stood in the middle of his busy cafe, watching people of all backgrounds enjoying coffee and conversation together. The construction workers had become regulars, starting their day with coffee before heading to work. Business people held meetings there, elderly folks gathered for their morning coffee, and students came to study. Sometimes, James reflected, serving coffee to a young veteran who reminded him of himself, the worst moments can lead to the best changes. This isn't just a cafe anymore, it's proof that when a community stands together, hate doesn't stand a chance. The story of Unity Coffee House became a case study in local business schools, teaching future entrepreneurs about social responsibility and community impact. But more importantly, it became a daily reminder that one person's courage, combined with a community's support, can transform a moment of discrimination into a legacy of inclusion.